What if the people history calls the Creek were never really one people at all? What if an entire nation was quietly assembled from the ashes of dozens of nations that had already died? Before we go any further, hit that like button right now. It costs you nothing, but it tells me this story deserves to be told properly, and it helps this reach the people who need to hear it. Subscribe if you want more forgotten history dug up from the ground, from old letters, and from human DNA. And if this surprises you even a little in the next few minutes, send it to one person who thinks history is boring, because this story might just change their mind completely. For a long time, we were told a simple story. A group of Native American towns scattered across the rivers of Georgia and Alabama were called Creek by English settlers, simply because of the waterways running through their land. It sounds tidy, it sounds harmless, but convenient stories are usually the ones hiding the most important details. The people themselves never called their nation Creek. They called it Muscogee. And the closer historians, archaeologists, and geneticists looked at where the Muscogee actually came from, the less that name looked like the story of one bloodline stretching quietly backward through the centuries. It looked like something else entirely. It looked like survival, engineered on purpose by human beings who refused to disappear when everything around them said they should. To understand what really happened here, you first have to go back to a world that existed long before any European ship reached this coastline. Long before Georgia or Alabama existed on any map, the American Southeast was home to one of the most advanced civilizations in North America. Historians call it the Mississippian world, and it was not a scattering of small villages living quietly along riverbanks. It was cities, with real power structures, built by people who understood engineering, astronomy, trade, and politics on a scale that still impresses researchers today. Massive earthen mounds rose as high as 60 feet into the sky, built entirely by hand, basket load by basket load, over generations of labor. Some of these mounds served as platforms for the homes of powerful chiefs, elevating their households physically above everyone else, a constant visible reminder of who held authority. Other mounds held the remains of entire ruling dynasties, buried with elaborate goods that traveled enormous distances to reach them. At the height of this civilization, thousands of people lived inside organized cities governed by hereditary rulers, supported by ranked social classes, connected by trade routes stretching more than 1,000 miles across the continent. Copper mined near the Great Lakes, shells harvested from the Gulf Coast. All of it moving steadily along river networks controlled by powerful chiefdoms that competed with each other, allied with each other, and occasionally went to war with each other. This was not a simple world of scattered hunters. It was a civilization with its own kings, its own religious order, and its own deep, confident sense of permanence. And then, within the span of roughly one human lifetime, all of it fell apart. Sometime around the middle of the 1500s, something happened that archaeologists still find almost too fast to fully believe. The great mound cities were abandoned, seemingly all at once. The elaborate burial traditions reserved for chiefs simply vanished from the record. Pottery styles that had defined entire regions for centuries changed completely, and changed quickly. When researchers dig down through the layers of earth from this exact period, they are not looking at gentle, gradual decline. They are looking at a civilization that stopped, almost overnight in archaeological terms, the way a heartbeat stops. By the time European colonists returned to these same river valleys, roughly 100 years later, they found something completely unrecognizable compared to what earlier Spanish explorers had described in their journals. No more great mound cities dominating the horizon, no more single powerful chiefdoms ruling wide stretches of territory. Instead, they found smaller towns, spread thinly across the land, loosely connected to one another, speaking more than one language within a short distance, yet somehow, remarkably, calling themselves one people. This is exactly where the real mystery begins. Because a civilization does not simply erase itself and rebuild into something completely unrecognizable without an enormous, violent reason behind it. Something devastating happened in that 100-year gap between collapse and rediscovery, and slowly piecing together exactly what happened has become one of the most fascinating detective stories hidden inside American history. The first answer is one most people have at least heard a little about: disease. When Spanish expeditions marched through the Mississippian Southeast during the 1500s, they carried something far more dangerous than any weapon in their arsenal. They carried smallpox, measles, and influenza, illnesses the people of this land had never once encountered before in their entire history. Bodies with no immune memory of these diseases stood almost no realistic chance against them. In some regions, entire towns could lose the overwhelming majority of their population within a single generation. Chiefdoms that had taken centuries to carefully build could effectively collapse before anyone truly understood what was even happening to them, let alone why. But disease alone does not explain everything that followed. It does not explain why the survivors reorganized themselves in the exact way they did, or why they ended up speaking entirely different languages side by side within one single political alliance. For that piece of the puzzle, you have to look at a second force, one that receives far less attention in most classrooms, but may have reshaped this entire region even more violently than sickness alone ever did. The Indian slave trade. Beginning in the late 1600s, English colonists in the Carolinas built a thriving commercial economy that depended, in significant part, on capturing and selling native people into slavery. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of indigenous men, women, and children were forcibly taken from their communities during this period. Some sold directly within the colonies, others shipped as far away as the Caribbean, never to return. And here is the part that makes this chapter even more painful to sit with. Many native nations were pulled into this brutal trade, not only as victims, but at times also as participants themselves, raiding rival groups for captives in exchange for European guns, ammunition, and manufactured goods they now depended on for survival. This entire era of chaos now has a name among historians, the Shatter Zone. It is a term coined by historian Robbie Etheridge to describe roughly 2 centuries of instability across the American Southeast, stretching from around the 1540s all the way to about 1730. It was not one single catastrophic event that struck like lightning. It was a slow, grinding unraveling, generation after generation, as disease steadily weakened populations, as slave raids destabilized fragile alliances, and as old systems of chiefly authority simply could not hold together under the relentless pressure. By the early 1700s, the entire world of the mound builders was gone, completely and irreversibly. But here is exactly where this story stops, being only a tragedy, and becomes something far more remarkable, because the people who survived this collapse did not vanish into scattered, broken, isolated remnants of what they once were. They did something almost unthinkable, given everything they had just endured. Across the region, in town after town, they came back together, not as the people they had been before all of this happened. As something new, chosen deliberately, in the ruins of everything familiar. We are roughly halfway through this story now, and this is exactly the part where everything changes. So, before we continue, take 15 seconds to subscribe and tap that notification bell, because what comes next is where the science gets genuinely surprising, and honestly, you do not want to miss where this evidence leads. Historians use a very specific term for what emerged out of the wreckage of the Mississippian world, coalescent societies. Sit with that phrase for a moment, because it is doing a tremendous amount of work in just 2 words. A coalescent society is not simply a population that recovered from disaster and kept living the way it always had before. It is a brand new society, deliberately built by survivors from many different, often previously unrelated groups, who consciously chose to join together for protection, for trade leverage, and simply to keep existing in a world now crowded with English, French, and Spanish colonial powers, all competing fiercely for territory and influence. The Muscogee Confederacy, understood this way, was never one single nation that simply endured hardship and kept going. It was dozens of smaller nations, carrying names like Coosa, Abeka, Tallapoosa, and Apalachicola, along with many smaller groups whose full identities barely survive anywhere in written record today, all fusing together into a single political structure because they had no other realistic path toward survival. And this is exactly where the evidence starts becoming genuinely fascinating, because 2 completely different fields of research, genetics and linguistics, both point toward the very same conclusion, arriving there from 2 completely separate directions. Start with language, because it tells a remarkably clear story on its own. Inside the historic Creek Confederacy, people were not speaking one unified tongue with a few regional accents scattered around. They were speaking genuinely separate languages, side by side, inside the exact same political system. Muscogee itself, yes, but also Hitchiti, Alabama, and Koasati, plus the Yuchi language, which linguists classify as an isolate, meaning it shows no close relationship to any other known language in the entire region. These were not simply dialects branching off from one shared linguistic root. They were the fingerprints of entirely separate peoples who had never once been a single nation before, now governing themselves together under one shared confederacy, while still keeping their own towns, their own clan systems, and their own distinct languages fully intact and unbroken. That detail alone should make you pause and reconsider everything you thought you knew. A single people, with one continuous history stretching unbroken through the centuries, does not typically end up speaking 4 or 5 completely unrelated languages within their own borders. But an alliance of desperate survivors, built rapidly under enormous pressure from many different broken communities, absolutely would look exactly like this. Now add the genetics on top of the linguistics, and the entire picture becomes even sharper and far more compelling. Ancient DNA research conducted on skeletal remains from the Mississippian era has repeatedly uncovered something that archaeologists had only ever been able to suspect from gaps in pottery styles and abandoned settlement patterns. In multiple river valleys across the southeast, The maternal genetic lineages found preserved in the soil from before the collapse do not cleanly match the lineages of the people living in those exact same valleys a century or two later. This does not necessarily mean the later population had absolutely no connection to the earlier one. It means the connection was never a smooth, unbroken line of descent staying in one single place across time. It was interrupted, violently broken by catastrophe, then rebuilt afterward by people arriving from elsewhere, intermarrying with survivors, merging entire clan systems together, and, in that long process, creating something genetically blended in a way a single, unchanging, isolated population never could produce on its own. At Etowah, the great mound city in northern Georgia that still draws curious visitors today, researchers studying the site's later history have found something genuinely striking. Broad Native American ancestry is well documented among the Mississippian remains excavated there, clearly shaped by wide regional mixing across an enormous area, but scientists have not been able to find the kind of narrow, tribe-specific genetic markers that would allow them to draw one clean, direct biological line connecting the mound builders of Etowah to any single modern nation, Creek or otherwise. In other words, science cannot hand you one simple, tidy sentence claiming these exact people directly became those exact people generations later. What it can show you instead is something bigger, and honestly, something far more powerful once you understand it. A pattern of repeated regional movement, mixing, and reorganization, appearing again and again, almost everywhere, researchers have looked closely enough to properly test it. And here is the twist that should genuinely change how you think about this entire story from this point forward. The absence of one clean, continuous genetic line is not actually a hole or a weakness in the evidence. It is the evidence itself. A people descended from one unbroken bloodline, sitting in one unbroken place, would leave behind one single, clear genetic signal for researchers to trace. The Muscogee instead show something far more complex, the fingerprint of many different independent communities, each shattered separately by disease and slave raiding, looking out together at the ruins of the world they once confidently knew, and choosing again and again, deliberately, to rebuild themselves into something that had genuinely never existed before them. If you are starting to feel something shift in how you think about identity and survival right now, that feeling is exactly right, and it is exactly why this story matters far beyond just one region of American history. Before we go any further, if this video has earned even a small amount of your respect so far, drop a comment with one single word describing how this makes you feel. I read every single comment, and it genuinely shapes what story gets researched and told next. This pattern of rebuilding did not stop with the original Confederacy either. It kept happening again and again, decade after decade, because it simply worked, and because it was the only strategy these communities had ever known for staying alive. Between roughly 1767 and 1821, Muscogee Creek towns pushing further south into Florida, intermarried with the remaining indigenous peoples still living on the peninsula, and also with African individuals who had bravely escaped slavery inside British and Spanish territories. Out of that further layer of mixing came an entirely new and genuinely distinct identity, the Seminole people. Ethnogenesis, the literal birth of a brand new people, happening for a second time within living memory, using the exact same underlying mechanism that had originally built the Creek Confederacy roughly a century earlier. Different survivors this time, different circumstances surrounding them, but fundamentally the same courageous choice to become something new together rather than quietly disappear alone. There's one more piece of evidence that deserves your attention because it comes not from bones or ancient teeth, but from the everyday political life of the Confederacy itself. Muscogee towns were traditionally divided into two categories, red towns and white towns. Red towns handled matters of war, and their leaders carried authority during conflict. White towns handled matters of peace, diplomacy, and law, and their leaders carried authority during negotiation and ceremony. On paper, this looks like a simple internal division of labor inside one unified culture, but historians studying the origins of specific towns have found something more revealing underneath that surface. Different towns entered this red and white system at different points, carrying different histories, different founding stories, and sometimes entirely different languages before they were absorbed into the shared framework. The system itself was not evidence of one ancient, unbroken tradition. It was evidence of a flexible structure built specifically to hold together communities that had not started out as one people at all, giving each incoming group a defined role, a form of respect, and a genuine stake in the survival of the whole. The green corn ceremony tells a similar story if you look closely enough. This annual renewal ceremony, still practiced by Muscogee communities today, involves fasting, the lighting of a new sacred fire, and the symbolic forgiveness of wrongs from the previous year. On the surface, it looks like an unbroken ritual passed down cleanly from the mound builders themselves. But anthropologists, studying its regional variations, have noted something important. The specific practices differ meaningfully from town to town, in ways that align closely with the different origin groups that fed into the Confederacy in the first place. The core idea of renewal stayed constant. The exact expression of that idea carried the fingerprints of many different founding communities, each contributing their own version of how a people should mark the turning of the year and the forgiveness of the past. Even the very structure of Muscogee clan membership reflects this same pattern of deliberate inclusion rather than pure bloodline. Clans were, and still are, matrilineal, meaning identity and belonging passed down through the mother's line. But clan membership was never treated as a closed genetic club. Outsiders could be formally adopted into a clan, gaining full standing and full belonging within that family structure, regardless of where they had originally come from. Captives, refugees, and even people from entirely different linguistic backgrounds could become, in every meaningful social sense, genuinely Muscogee through ceremony and acceptance rather than through ancestry alone. This is not a minor cultural footnote. It is arguably the single mechanism that made the entire coalescent society possible in the first place. A system built to absorb strangers and transform them into kin again and again, precisely when the alternative was extinction. By the time you place the archaeology, the genetics, the linguistics, and the clan structures side by side, a single coherent picture finally comes into focus. This was never a story about one bloodline quietly enduring hardship and isolation. It was a story about a deliberate social technology refined over roughly 2 centuries, for turning devastated strangers into a functioning, unified nation, fast enough to survive the collapse of an entire world around them, and strong enough to negotiate as equals with European empires within a few short generations of that collapse. Now here's the part of this entire story that is genuinely easy to skip past if you only think about it in terms of maps, migration arrows, and cold genetic charts on a screen. Try to actually imagine, for just a moment, being one of the last people from a particular Mississippian town during this period. Your chiefdom is completely gone. Your relatives have died from a disease that did not even have a name in your own language, let alone any known cure. Your entire political world has collapsed within your own single lifetime. Not slowly across distant centuries you only read about, but within years you can personally remember living through. You do not have the comfort of patiently waiting for future historians to eventually make sense of what happened to you and your family. You have to decide, right now, in real time, with absolutely no guarantee of survival, who you're going to be from this point forward, and who you are willing to call family in order to simply keep existing at all. That impossible decision, made over and over again by thousands of individual people across roughly 2 centuries, around flickering council fires, through careful intermarriages, through adopted clan relationships that formally welcome complete strangers in as genuine kin, is exactly what the DNA evidence is quietly recording for us today, hundreds of years later. Not a single bloodline passed neatly down unbroken through time. A choice, made repeatedly under absolutely unimaginable pressure, by ordinary people who simply refuse to let total collapse also mean total disappearance. So why does any of this actually matter if you personally have no connection at all to Muscogee or Creek history? Because this entire story quietly challenges one of the oldest assumptions we all carry about what supposedly makes a nation real and legitimate in the first place. We tend to instinctively believe that a true nation absolutely has to trace back to one single origin, one unbroken bloodline, one continuous thread reaching far back into the deep past. The archaeological and genetic record coming out of the American Southeast tells a very different, and honestly a far more human story than that. It suggests some of the most resilient peoples in all of human history were never actually the ones who simply stayed exactly the same generation after generation. They were the ones who somehow knew how to become something genuinely new, again and again when circumstances demanded it, without ever losing the things that truly mattered most: their language, their clan systems, their sacred ceremonies, their names, even while almost everything else around them was actively being destroyed in real time. The Muscogee were never simply passive descendants of the ancient mound builders, quietly waiting around for history to happen to them. They were the deliberate architects of their own continuation as a people, a nation that did not survive the total collapse of an old, familiar world purely by luck or by accident. It survived because ordinary human beings, standing in the middle of unimaginable generational loss, chose again and again to build something entirely new. And maybe that is the real lesson quietly buried underneath all the broken pottery shards, all the ancient DNA samples, and all the faded colonial maps in this story. Survival was never really about staying exactly the same forever. It was about having the raw courage to become something new, together as a community, precisely when everything familiar had already been violently taken away. If this story moved you even slightly while watching, that feeling is worth sitting with for a moment, because somewhere buried inside that simple idea is a truth far bigger than just one nation's history. It is a truth about what it actually takes for any people, anywhere on this planet, to endure the truly unendurable and still choose one another. Think about what this actually means for how we tell history in general, not just for one nation in the American Southeast. So often, the story of indigenous nations gets told as a story of pure loss, a slow fade from a golden past into a diminished present, as if survival itself were somehow less impressive than the world that came before it. The Muscogee story flips that entirely. Survival here was not passive, it was not luck. It was an active, ongoing act of creation, repeated by thousands of people who had every reason to give up and chose instead to build. That is a far more difficult thing to do than simply enduring unchanged. And it requires trust in strangers who speak a different language. It requires letting go of the exact way your grandparents did things, while still protecting the deeper meaning behind why they did it. It requires imagining a future that does not yet exist, in the middle of a present that has already fallen apart. This is also why the word ancestry can be misleading if you only think of it as a straight line drawn backward through time. For the Muscogee, ancestry looks more like a river delta than a single stream, dozens of separate channels of history, each carrying its own people. These channels converge together into one wide, powerful current strong enough to carry an entire nation forward into the future. That is not a weaker kind of identity than a single unbroken bloodline. In many ways, given what it survived, it is a stronger one. If you made it this far into the video, you clearly care about the kind of history that gets buried under lazy textbook labels and oversimplified names. So subscribe right now, because there are more stories exactly like this one waiting to be told. Stories about people who were never given proper credit for how hard they fought, generation after generation, just to remain themselves.